Hi everyone, welcome back to the Stitches and Scribbles channel. My name is Erin and I have a reading podcast for you today. This is going to be all the books that I read in July of 2026 and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of them. The one odd thing about this month is that I actually only read 3 physical books. And most of the books that I read were actually audiobooks. So most of them I'm going to be showing you from my phone screen instead of a physical copy, just because that's what I was doing this month. Part of the reason for so many audiobooks is I was doing a lot of crafting to kind of get ahead on filming YouTube videos and tutorials and things before the school year starts in at the end of August actually, so just a couple weeks from when I'm filming this. And probably about when you're seeing this, I will be back at school. So I'm just kind of trying to get ahead on videos, which means I'm doing a lot of like working on craft projects and not as much like sitting and reading a physical book. So I listened to just a lot of audiobooks this month. The first 2 that I read, I'm actually going to show you on the screen together. Last month, so in June, I listened to the first Crazy Rich Asians book, and then I listened to the second 2 in July. So without giving away too many spoilers about the series overall, first of all, I highly recommend this series. It is different from the movie, and I talked about this more in my previous book podcast where I read the first book. Just some kind of differences between the book and the movie. Definitely the storyline in the books is way more in depth than what it shows in the movie. There are a lot more cultural discussions and present in the movie, which I understand. You're trying to condense a like 400 or 500 page book into a hour and a half, 2-hour movie. So a lot of it is going to need to be cut out. But talking about the book 2 and book 3. So book 2, I was really surprised at how much the character of Kitty Pong, who is now going by Catherine Tai, is a main character in the books. All of the books still follow Rachel and Astrid pretty closely, but other characters kind of take turns being in the spotlight. So Kitty Pong, as well as a new character, are very much centered in the book China Rich Girlfriend. There's also a lot of stuff uncovered about Rachel's backstory, including who her father is and kind of some research that she wants to do in mainland China to figure out those family connections. And then in book 3, Rich People Problems, really follows kind of the culmination of Astrid's story. Specifically, Nick and Rachel are present in the book, but I would say not as much as the first 2 books. And I would say a pretty big chunk of the 3rd book is following Astrid, but it's also following the kind of last months of Suyi's storyline. Suyi is Nick's grandmother, if you're only familiar with the movie. And it still follows Kitty Pong and Colette from the 2nd book and kind of their very odd relationship with each other as the books progress. So highly recommend the books. They're definitely a long read. They're not a quick beach read. I think the first audiobook was at least 14 hours. The second one was 15 and the third one was 16. They are pretty dense books, even though they kind of get marketed as like the lighthearted beach read type of thing. They do cover a lot of stuff. So I would just kind of keep that in mind before you read. It is a commitment to read the series, but it's definitely well worth it. The next book I read, I was really excited about. I saw that this book was released last year, but Louis Satcher, who wrote the book Holes, as well as many, many other children's books, released his first book for adults, and it's called The Magician of Tiger Castle. And again, I listened to this as an audiobook. I'm hoping my camera is focusing on there. This was a really interesting book. It combines kind of some subtle time travel elements with a very like typical fantasy setting. To me, the vibes of this book were very reminiscent of things like The Princess Bride, where it feels like just a very typical classic fantasy. And it was very interesting. It is also one of the first fantasy books I have read with a very unreliable narrator. The main character is, I'm forgetting, oh, his name is Anatoly, who is the court magician for the kingdom of Esquivita, which is listed as being south of France. There's definitely some Italian influence on it as well. Definitely a fictional, I'm pretty sure it's a fictional country. I don't think that this was ever a real place, although now I'm questioning that statement. But Anatoly is the magician for the king, and his definition of magician is different than what you might think it is. It's not like doing magic tricks and things like that. He's almost more of a somewhere between an apothecarist and a healer sometimes, but there are some magical elements, but a lot of it involves like potion making stuff going on. And Anatoly is a very unreliable narrator. Like, he tells the reader the truth of what's going on, but the way he interacts with other characters, he is frequently not telling the whole truth. And the book is written as if he's sort of reflecting on his time in Esquivita from modern day, because of one of his experiments that went wrong that caused him to have a very, very long lifespan. But it also follows Princess Tulia and the man that she has fallen in love with, and Anatoly kind of trying to help them, but also kind of trying to control everything that's going on, and all of the subsequent things that happen because of that. So it was a very interesting book. I gave it 4 stars, and I forgot to say that for both Crazy Rich Asians books, I gave them 5 stars. I gave The Magician of Tiger Castle 4 stars, mostly because I don't always like an unreliable narrator or a narrator who is not always truthful in what they're doing. But it was a very well-written book and a very interesting book to read, especially since I remember that I loved reading Holes as a kid. But this felt very different from Holes. So it was an interesting read. The next one I read was Our Lady of Fatima by William T. Walsh. I gave this one 5 stars, and this is from the My Catholic Library collection, which is a book subscription where they send you one of these beautiful book editions every month. And I go to Adoration once a week, and I like to bring a book with me. So this was my Adoration book for the last few weeks. And this details the apparitions at Our Lady of Fatima through interviews with people who witnessed it and research collecting. So it reads like it's a novel almost, but it is factually correct to what happened during those events. I really enjoyed this one. The one that I read last month was The Interior Castle by St. Teresa of Avila. That was a much harder read to get through because it's very theological, philosophical, almost psychological in a lot of sense, and this felt more like reading a novel. So I did really enjoy this. I enjoyed both of them, but this one was easier to get through. So I was really excited about that one, and I love the My Catholic Library collection. I now have 2 more past the Interior Castle one. One of them, I forget what one of them is. It's currently in my Adoration bag, and I can't see it from where I'm sitting. And then the other one is The Imitation of Christ, which I know that I have already read. So you might not see one of these in this podcast for a little bit because I'm taking a break and reading something else during Adoration. But I will come back to these when there's another one that I haven't read that comes in the mail. The next book I read as an audiobook again. This was The Lost Bookshop by Evie Woods, which I really enjoyed. I actually also have the physical copy of this book, but I have already lent it to my mom. But I had it in my Libby Holds list, and a friend actually brought me a copy as well, just as like a fun little gift because she found it in a little library. And since it had bookshop in the title, she thought I would like it. And I gave this book 5 stars. I do really think for this one, the audiobook was worth it. So if you have access to the audiobook, I highly recommend it because there are characters from different parts of Ireland and England who all have different accents. So I like having audiobooks for stories like that where you can kind of hear the character with how they do the narration. So it is a multi-generational story, or not multi-generational. It follows multiple characters in history as they're all kind of trying to figure out the same thing about this mysterious bookshop. And I'm not going to give away any more of it because I think I read 2 books too close together that had similar plot lines and my brain is starting to forget which one is which. But I know that I really liked The Lost Bookshop. It was really well done, especially the audio version. It was a good, like, cozy, romantic, light fantasy book with a lot of historical fiction elements as well. The next book that I read was American Dirt by Janine Cummings. This was actually recommended by a friend of my grandmother's, so I'm really glad that I picked it up. She said that she read it for her book club. My lighting is going to go crazy with holding the phone up, so I do apologize for that. American Dirt follows a mother and her son who are fleeing their home in Mexico to try to cross the border into the United States because of fear of further retaliation from the cartels. And this was a hard book to get through, not because it was intellectually difficult to read. It's very emotional. It's very sad. But I think it's a really important story. So it gives a lot of details of why certain people would choose to try to cross the border illegally. Lydia and her son, the main character and her son, end up meeting other people who are also trying to cross the border for different reasons. So it kind of gives you a picture of what might be going through someone's head when they choose to take that journey. And I think that this is a really important story, even though this is fictional, to provide some empathy for people who may be going through that, especially for children who have gone through that, because it's not necessarily their choice to take this journey. But it was a really well-written book and very emotional. This one I also would recommend listening to the audiobook for the inclusion of some Spanish phrases, as well as like city names and things like that to make sure that you're hearing the correct pronunciation. But this was a very, very well done book. And I won't say I enjoyed reading it because a lot of it was very sad, but I think it's a very important story. And I forget if I said this, but I gave it 5 stars. Okay, the next book I read, I hated. Full disclosure. This book, I actually purchased a physical copy several years ago. I was actually on a weekend bachelorette trip out of state and people were stopping and getting souvenirs and things. And I stopped in a bookstore and got a book as my souvenir instead of picking like little tchotchke items or things like that, which is now kind of what I try to do on vacations. I will get like a skein of hand-dyed yarn if I can find it, or I will get a book from a local bookstore, especially if I can find one that takes place in the city that we're in or the state that we're in. This one did not, but it was more to support a small bookstore. And I then ended up listening to the audiobook of it because it became available on my library's Libby platform as a like Lucky Day book or something like that, or maybe it was just available, I don't know. So I decided to go ahead and listen to the audiobook to try to get through my list of physical books faster. And I did not like this. I'm kind of mad that I bought the hardcover book. I'm trying to say as much as I can without showing you the title yet, because I know that this was a very popular book for a while. I gave this one 2 stars. And I think I now just kind of have to show you what book it is. It was Wayward by Amelia Hart. I'm hoping that my camera will focus. There we go. So I definitely bought it because the cover was so pretty. However, that was a mistake. This was not a good book for me. This is the book that I kept mixing up with The Lost Bookshop because they both kind of follow several points in history where the stories kind of intertwine together. I loved The Lost Bookshop. I hated this one. So this one follows 3 women who are all related to each other. One in 2019, one in 1619, and one in 1942. So modern day from when the book was published, the time of the witch trials in England, not in the US, and World War II. I really wanted to like this book. I liked the really subtle magic system that was being built up because it is a historical fantasy, again, like The Lost Bookshop. But this one, I think, was a lot sadder than I thought it was going to be. B, I think there are some plot points in here that I wish I had known were present before I read the book. So if you're going to read this one, I highly suggest you find a platform that has content warnings that you can check before you read it, because it did include a lot of things that I was not prepared for, especially since I was listening to it, versus reading American Dirt, which I just talked about. Like, I knew what was probably going to be present in that book before I read it, but this one, a lot of it was a surprise. So I use Storygraph to track my reading. I highly recommend that because you can check content warnings on books, and I kind of wish I had looked at the list of these before I read the book because I might not have read it. It does deal with a lot of very traumatic loss. And I won't go too much farther into the details of what those are, partially because this is a monetized video and there are certain phrases I can't use. But it is not a lighthearted fantasy historical fiction book. And I think that some of the points of traumatic loss that were used as plot points were not done in a way that it was meaningful. It kind of was, it happened and the characters just pushed through it. There was no processing of it, and I think some things were not given the gravity that they needed, especially considering how frequently those traumatic points were thrown into the book. So with all that said, someone else might enjoy this type of story. I had trouble finishing it, but by the point I realized I really didn't like it, I was more than halfway through the audiobook. And usually if I'm more than halfway through a book, I try to finish it. If I'm going to mark something as did not finish, it's usually within the first 10% of the book. So I wanted to finish it since I had committed to it, but this will definitely not be a book I recommend and not be a book that I keep. I will definitely be donating my copy somewhere. It's pretty rare that I have that strong of a negative feeling about a book. Usually I'll say like, oh, this just wasn't for me. This one I think is a read with caution story. I actually had another book by the same author in my Libby wish list that I took out of my wish list because I saw that a lot of the content warnings were the same as for Wayward. So I guess just keep that in mind in general if you're going to read from that author. I don't know how many other books she has, but it seems like there are some common themes in her fantasy books. After that, I needed something much more lighthearted, so I went for a children's book. This was, again, an audiobook, and I gave it 4 stars. This was Iron-Hearted Violet by Kelly Barnhill. Last month, or maybe the month before, I read The Ogress and the Orphans by the same author and really enjoyed that one. So I wanted to give another one of her books a try. This one was definitely more like surreal fantasy than the other ones were. It was almost like a had some elements of something like Alice in Wonderland, as well as elements of something like Percy Jackson. And I'll throw The Princess Bride in there too, because there were some similar vibes like that. But it follows Princess Violet, who is very clever and really loves telling stories. And she stumbles into a secret room in the castle she lives in and finds a forbidden book that talks about an evil being who existed at one point in time but doesn't anymore. And she reads the book and slowly realizes that this evil being is still here and starts to kind of be coerced by this evil being. And that sounds really dark for a children's book. I will give it that. But a lot of what the story focused on was the effects of negative self-image and how that can really bring someone down. And I think that that was, again, an important story to tell. The other two Kelly Barnhill books I've read, I would say easily fit into middle grade. This one, I think I would also put it as middle grade, but with a little bit of caution. I might kind of check in with kids who choose to read this book. I don't think it's quite young adult, though. I think the characters are too young. But there are also plenty of middle grade books out there that do have kind of dark themes in them. I'm a school librarian. I don't think I've mentioned that yet in this podcast. I have definitely had students come up to me and ask for sad books, so that is not anything out of the ordinary. But this one, I think it has a really powerful message by the end of that being who you are is so much more valuable than trying to be someone else. And it ended up being a really beautiful story despite being kind of sad and dark for parts of it. So I highly recommend this one. And I also think a fantasy world is a very mentally safe place to work through issues like this, because this is so clearly a fantasy book. There's not kind of the real life triggers that might be associated with self-esteem. So there's no bullying happening by a classmate in a realistic fiction setting. It's this evil entity who is telling Violet things in such a way that she wants to believe it. So a fantasy book can be a good place to kind of work through issues like that, because it's not the same as real life, but the real life message is still there. So I really enjoyed this one. The next book I read was a nonfiction book, and this one was a physical copy that I was reading very slowly while simultaneously listening to all the audiobooks. I was reading this for a few pages before going to bed at night and listening to audiobooks during the day. This was called Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party: How an Eccentric Group of Victorians Discovered Prehistoric Creatures and Accidentally Upended the World. So this talks about how the discovery of dinosaurs had an impact on Victorian society, specifically Victorian England, obviously. And just kind of all of the worldview shifts that happened with the discovery of dinosaurs. So it was very, very interesting. I gave this one 5 stars. Just kind of a fun nonfiction read. There's a lot of it that's very silly because people really didn't know what to think of dinosaurs at that time. They were such a fascination that the attitude towards them became very, in modern times, it seems very humorous the way that people talked about dinosaurs. So if you need a good lighthearted nonfiction, I highly recommend that one. And on a final note, the last book that I read in July was Lost Words, or The Little Book of Lost Words: Collywobbles, Snollygosters, and 86 Other Surprisingly Useful Terms Worth Resurrecting. This was a very easy book to read. It's like 1 word and definition per page. They're all very silly, and the way it's formatted is it has the word, the definition, and then a modern day sentence to use the word. So the one I happened to open up to was Scrambler, and they all have a historic picture to go with them. But it says Scrambler is from 19th century Scotland. It's an uninvited guest who appears only at mealtimes. Brian's Scrambler friend was more interested in Brian's mom's cooking than he was in Brian. So they're just kind of silly phrases being used, but very fun like coffee table book to have out at parties. And this one I found in a little free library, so I didn't even pay for that one. And I forgot to say, for Dinosaurs at the Dinner Party, that is the only one from this month that I actually purchased from Barnes & Noble. Yeah, that's going to be it for this episode. Definitely a lot of reading was done this month. It was not so usually over the summer I get through books much faster because I spend more time reading. However, since most of these were audiobooks, even though the number of hours I was reading a book through audio was much higher than what I usually do, the number of books I got through was not as high as if I had only been reading physical books, because I read physical books very quickly, but audiobooks I'm listening to someone read it, so it takes longer. But I listened to over 5,000 minutes of audiobooks in the month of July, which I have never gotten anywhere close to that before, so that was kind of a fun experiment. And I really enjoyed the process of listening to all the audiobooks. So it might be something that I try to keep in my routine a little bit more as the school year starts, maybe while going for walks or things like that. But I will probably go back to a higher percentage of physical books during the school year. That's going to be it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw today, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. If you want to follow me somewhere else, you can see that information in the description box. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.